皆さんこんにちは。それでは定刻となりましたの。
Good afternoon. It is now time for us to start the 195th Ocean Forum, and it is current ocean noise issues and guidance, European, American, and Asian cases, and we thank everyone for attending. And this time we are implementing this physically in the building in Toranomon, as well as live streaming on YouTube. There are also the streaming with subtitles. Those of you participating online, please access the link at the bottom of the screen. And before we start, we'd like to hear from the President of Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I am Hide Sakaguchi, President of the Ocean Policy Research Institute of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Due to circumstances, I have to be participating online today. Let me apologize for that. And from Mr. Akamatsu, I have been instructed to speak in Japanese. So I apologize that today I will be speaking in Japanese. Now, this summer, on a global scale, every day we are seeing record high temperatures, and in Tokyo too, every day it is experiencing sweltering heat. And so I would like to, first of all, thank you for participating in this 195th forum, Ocean Forum. So at the outset, let me first give some greetings. Now, I mentioned Tokyo, but as you see in the screen, I actually live close to the Koshigoi coast in the city of Kamakura, and it's about 20 meters from the beach, and every day, late at night, it's the Shonan coast, therefore there are a lot of motorcyclers, but then things quiet down, and when I'm sleeping at night, I can hear the sound of the waves, which is quite comforting. And in this way, in the ocean, well, waves are made by the wind. Other than the sound of waves, there are many other sounds. For example, the tidal motion caused by lunar gravity, or the ocean circulation, currents, also the earth crustal movement, such as earthquake and volcanic eruptions, will create sound. And also, as you will be hearing today, there are the vocalization of marine life. And so in this way, well, there are the species that may not vocalize. For example, seaweed may make sounds when they overlap. So there are all kinds of sounds, meaning that the ocean is not a very quiet place. And it is there that humans will navigate vessels, and then in the ports and the seabeds there will be the piling and drilling, and also recently in the deep sea, in order to mine resources such as rare earth and rare metal, there are pumps that pump up the mud on the seabed, so that you can say that in some places the ocean can be quite noisy. Now, there is the sound of the sea, which is sometimes natural, sometimes made by humans. And the sound that is communicated in the sea, from the surface, and then underwater you cannot see deep down. And so to find out what's going on undersea, there are convenient equipment. For example, there's the fish finders to find fish shoals. And then from the reflection of sound or transmittivity, there are the physical sensors to look at the seabed, topography, and also compared to electromagnetic waves, sound waves can travel easier, and therefore it is used from ancient times as a means of communication. Sensors and communication means actually it is not humans that use sound in this way. From much way past, actually, marine mammals such as whales and porpoise and fish, they may find predators and run away, or they may find prey to eat them, or they might use sound to communicate with each other. And with research, that is becoming increasingly clear. And in the forum today, Dr. Akamatsu is such a professional engaged in such research. Now, so you have these noise, and if humans create noise, then there are those living creatures that have been using sound before humans, and it's possible that there could be potential impact, especially marine development and also deep sea explorations. When that is conducted, this kind of concern will increase on a daily basis, and it is a concern what is taking place. Therefore, at the Ocean Forum this time, we have invited experts in the marine acoustics from Europe, the United States, and Asia. And we are going to think about the noise issues in the ocean at this point in time, the impact on the marine life and response. And we would like to think about these issues together with you. And I'd like to emphasize that we are to think about it together, and they are here to give us a lecture for that purpose. And after the lectures from the speakers, there will be a panel discussion and how people can use the ocean in a sustainable way, and what about the living creatures in the ocean that have been around from before humans. How can we mitigate the ocean noise, and what should be the future direction is what I hope we can discuss. And also, the theme for today is the ocean noise and how to assess them. And actually, in 2021, 2 years ago, in Japan too, the Marine Acoustics Society came up with a guidance on measurement methods of underwater sound and evaluation methods. And I hope that you can refer to this recommendation. The experts who have been invited to the Ocean Forum this time, and those of you in the hall and those of you participating online, through a discussion today, we can think about how to contribute to updating information. And these sounds are communicated globally. Therefore, we have to have the management of ocean noise globally. And I hope that today can become a milestone so that we can take that step. And the Ocean Forum today, we have come up with a new idea this time. That is, after the lecture and panel discussion, with it will be by the participants who are here physically, the participants here and the experts who have spoken. We will set up an area where there can be direct discussions so that with the experts you will be able to exchange views directly. And so if you don't have the courage to raise your hand and ask questions, I think that you can ask questions and also communicate your views during this final session. I hope that we can have a very active discussion so that we can think about this ocean noise and how to solve them, solve the issues. So it may be a rather long day, but I hope that you'll participate to the end. And I hope that we can have a very hot discussion that is on par with the heat outside. So I hope to have your cooperation today. So thank you, Mr. Sakaguchi. And we would now like to start the lecture. And we will first hear from Europe. And we'd like to hear from Professor Michel Andre of the University of Catalonia.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Tom, for this invitation, and from the Ocean Policy Research Institute to have us and bring in this message from all over the world in terms of the ocean noise, which is an issue. The title of my presentation is Underwater Noise in the EU, European Union, Challenges in a Changing Ocean. Is a changing ocean from different aspects. First of all, because the ocean is changing. We know that there are some effects from climate change, acidification, and other actions, but also from the perception that we have from the ocean. Our perception has changed, so it's not only the physical aspect of the ocean that is changing, but also our perception that is changing. And it's changing especially in terms of the sound dimension of the ocean. For all human life, we have ignored the sound dimension of the ocean. We didn't know that the ocean was driven by sound. Our ear is not made to hear underwater, and this is why we have, along all these tens of thousands of years, ignored that the ocean was driven by sounds. And when we discovered that there was this new dimension in the ocean, at the same time that we had the technology to access this data, we realized that we had contaminated it with noise from human activity without even knowing the effect of this noise produced by our action in the ocean. So we have just started to realize this a few tens of years ago, maybe 40 years ago, and now we have a bunch of data we know, so we have no excuse. We have this responsibility, all of us in this room and in other places, to act because we have the knowledge. Of course, we don't have all the knowledge, and probably along these talks, we will see that we lack most of the knowledge that is necessary, but we still have enough of data to start moving, to move really forward. I would start saying that our perception of this changing ocean in terms of noise is also related to species. When we discovered this noise effect, or the potential noise effect in the ocean, we decided as a community, we were not very many at that time, we're not still very many, we decided to concentrate on marine mammals. We understood that marine mammals, because they use sounds to communicate, and this is basic for their daily life, they were the first candidates that would probably suffer from the exposure to noise from human activities. And for almost 20 years, we almost exclusively focused on whales and dolphins and pinnipeds to look at the sensitivity to this noise and to try to find some threshold value that will help us to regulate this introduction of artificial noise in the ocean. But very recently, 10 years ago, we found that other species that lack of a proper ear, they cannot properly hear a sound, they are sensitive to another aspect of the sound, which is the particle acceleration. So they are sensitive to the vibration component of the sound. Might be affected maybe more than even the cetacean, not only because they are sensitive to this vibration, but also because they have not the same mobility to escape from an area that is polluted by a sound. So they are receiving a dose of sound that is probably higher than any cetacean species that we know of. So I have put on the screen a recent paper. Actually, this is a special issue that came out in Frontiers. This is called Marine Vertebrates and Sound, that provides the up-to-date data on how marine vertebrates perceive and produce sometimes sounds. And to my point of view, there was also a tipping point in 2011 when we found that marine invertebrates were sensitive to sound and could be affected by sound. And we found that there was this acoustic trauma when they were exposed to human noise. And in 2021, looking further to this possible effect to other species, other taxa, we also found that aquatic plants are affected by human noise. So now we are considering noise not only as a species-specific issue, but really we look at it as an ecosystem problem, and we need to address it. And if in the past we had an issue to address human noise, just thinking of roughly 90 species of whales and dolphins. Now we are facing the sensitivity of thousands of species that we don't have any idea of how they deal with these sounds. So we have a big task, and hopefully along our talk we will try to show where we are. Said that, I come back to the EU, and I'm going to say something that everybody knows now, that the maritime traffic has increased and will probably increase in the future, and this will be associated to an increase of human noise in the ocean. And there is this concern over the last 30 years now that this impact might be critical for the ocean balance. And at the EU level, in 2008, there was the decision to adopt what was called the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, MFSD, that includes different descriptors of and indicators of the environmental status, and that includes, for the first time, noise as a source of pollution. This is the first time that, in terms of a regulatory aspect, noise is introduced as a source of pollution. And as a matter of fact, the member states, so all the members that conform the EU, 27 now, were required to implement a monitoring program in their waters to take appropriate measures to reach what was called a good environmental status by 2020. So this was the objective in 2008, and 2020 has passed, and we are a little bit behind this scheduled. We have progressed, and I will try to comment on this. But yeah, we haven't yet reached this commitment that we had to reach this good environmental status, but we have made some good advancement. In terms of the indicator, this is the number 11 of a list of 11 descriptors of this good environmental status of the ocean. This is noise and other form of energy, and we have focused more on noise as a start, and not yet addressed light or electromagnetism. So we have focused in the last years in sound, and we came up with two descriptors. One was dealing with impulsive sounds, which is related to pile driving, seismic activity and explosions, and then continuous noise that is associated mostly to shipping. And we came up with these two figures, impulsive sound from 10 hertz to 10 kilohertz, and then third octave band centered at 63 and 125 hertz. Why we chose these 63 and 125? This is because at that time, so we are back 15 years ago, there was a clear idea that no natural or biological sound was having an energy in this third octave band at 63 and 125 hertz. So if we would find a level high enough in these two third octave bands, then we could attribute this to shipping noise. So this is why we decided to focus on these two frequencies, although of course we know that ship noise in particular has a very broadband sound production. And there was a series of reports that were published at the EU level, and that was asking the member states to take measures. And this is a sort of calendar, so from 2008 up to last year. And there is particularly this paper that came out last year. It's called A Decade of Underwater Noise Research in Support of the European Marine Strategy Framework Directive, that deals with all these different steps. So in 2008, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive passes into EU law, so it's a law. And there was a publication in 2010 that was recommended this aspect to the member states, to all these states at the EU level, that will have to take actions both for impulsive sound and continuous sounds. In 2012, this was completed, and there was noise guidance that was published. In 2014, there was also completed with the data that was coming, and there is a tipping point again in 2017 when the Commission understood that these two first indicators, they were pressure indicator. So we wanted, first of all, to have a sort of a state-of-the-art of what the level of sounds were in the EU waters. So first we needed to agree on how to measure, how to define, and to see how much energy human activity were introducing in the ocean, leaving aside the impact. And in 2017, the Commission asked the same group of experts to address an impact indicator. So coming from a pressure indicator to an impact, and to see how much this was affecting the marine life. And so this was a mandate in 2017, and in 2020, first for impulsive sound, and then in 2022 for continuous sound, we came up with this decision to put a value, a threshold that the regulators could use when they decide to regulate. It's important to say that even though this law comes from the EU, the member states have the last word, and they need to apply it, but then there is a national autonomy to apply when they interpret this effect. So this is a mandate from the EU, but each member state has the last word to decide on how they apply it. So this is a summary of what I just said. So in terms of the definition of impulsive and continuous noise indicators under what we call the descriptor 11, again, this list of 11 descriptors of the good environmental status of the ocean. The first one deals with impulsive sound, the D11.1, and the D11.2 with continuous, again associated to shipping noise. So in 2010, the Commission decision stated that for impulsive sound, it was the proportion of days and their distribution within a calendar year over areas of a determined surface, as well as the spatial distribution in which anthropogenic sound source exceed levels that are likely to entail significant impact on marine animals measured as sound exposure. This is a very broad the definitions, especially because at that time we didn't know where the threshold would be. So it was a generic aspect, and actually what we were asking is to have over a calendar year and in certain areas the number of time that the level of noise produced by human activity, again seismic, pipe driving and exposure, was exceeding a certain level. And in 2017, the decision from the Commission said that, okay, now we have this, we want to know the impact, and I will come back to this. For D11.2, which is dealing with continuous sound, again associated to shipping mostly, the member states were asked to monitor this sound, so to physically put hydrophones close to shipping line and to monitor the level of noise associated to these shipping routes. And if, again, this was going above a certain level, the member states were given some time to correct and to lower this level of sound close to these shipping routes. And again, in 2017, the decision of the Commission was, now that we have acted this, we need to be able to produce an impact indicator in terms of the effect on marine life. This is the EU, and the EU is divided in exclusive economic zones. And what you can say that there are some legal bodies that already regulate these different waters, in particular the Barcelona Convention, the Bucharest Convention, ELCOM and OSPAR, that cover the whole EU waters. So this is a reality, that was there before the MSFD was launched. These are the different EU-funded projects. So since 2008, when the Marine Framework Strategic Directive was launched, a series of EU-funded projects were put in place to address the need to create enough data to feed this need of regulating the introduction of noise in the marine environment. And this is a list of the different projects that took place since 2012 up today. Some of these projects are still active, and I will show you in the next map where they were taking place. So you can see that they are covering the whole water. Jonas is the North Atlantic from the UK down to the Azores. The Med Sea in pink. Jomopans, which is all these North Sea, and the Baltic for Bias. So all these projects that took place for the last 12 years now have fed all the data that were needed to have data for this pressure indicator. Okay, sorry for this small letter. I hope you can read it. I cannot from here, but these are these different EU-funded projects, not related to what I just saw, but addressing the issue of ocean noise. And it is very interesting to see that before this date, or before the MSFD was approved, there was absolutely no call at a public EU-funded level. They were addressing this ocean noise. There was nothing, there was no public money directed to the issue of ocean noise. And since then, you can see this list, and there are other projects that are active now. So it is more than 35 projects that were funded in the EU, and knowing that the EU-funded project are confirmed by consortia of sometimes 20 or 25 institutions all over these 27 countries in Europe. So this is a massive amount of data that was produced, and that has been produced and continue to be produced for the last 12 years now. So I mentioned in this calendar that we saw these very two important publication. So there was one that is addressing the continuous noise, and the following one we will see later for impulsive sound. And this is setting really now the base for all the member states to apply the Marine Framework Strategy Directive to address the issue of ocean noise. And we came up with a definition of lobe. And the definition is the lobe is the noise level at which individual animals start to have adverse effects that could affect their fitness. This is the general definition of what the lobe is, and what does that mean? Adverse effect that include behavioral disturbance, stress, reduced communication space, and temporary or permanent habitat loss. This is what we consider to be an adverse effect coming from noise. And fitness, which is what is affected by this adverse effect, is the ability of an individual to successfully reproduce relative to other individuals in the population. If an animal experiences a loss in fitness, it means that its reproductive output is affected negatively, even if only slightly. So this really addresses what I mentioned in terms of the impact. We came from the pressure indicator to the impact indicator. And as I mentioned, the D11C2, which is the impulsive sound that we'll look at later, noise level can be spatially average sound pressure level or excess of this level. So the threshold value, which is the mandate from the EU, this is the lower part of the screen. So DG Noise, which is this task group of experts, so this group of experts that came up with this recommendation. So the task group on noise advised to set the continuous noise threshold value to be 20% of the target species habitat having noise levels above lobe, that we just defined, not to be exceeded in any month of the signed year, in agreement with the conservation objective of the 80% of the carrying capacity habitat loss. Size. So this is very important. So we consider that if there is a level of sound that exceeds 20% of the time of a calendar year, that means that the area is not covered by the good environmental status. So this is the first time we are putting a threshold, not on a level of sound, but in terms of the habitat loss or effect. And this is an advice based on available information, considering the requests of the Commission for cooperation at EU level between member states, considering regional and sub-regional specifics. Besides this advice, the member states have the task to establish the threshold values nationally. It means that, as I mentioned, this is a mandate from the EU, but each member state has the autonomy to set the different threshold depending on the habitat. You cannot compare the Mediterranean Sea with the North Sea. We have at the EU level these differences in the different seas. So each country or each of the regions has the capacity to set the different threshold value. Then we go to the impulsive sound. So this is this report that was published in 2020. And again, these threshold value are based on the principle and a review of existing methods for identifying threshold values to reduce impacts to biodiversity, both habitat and species. And the following advice is provided. And we divided it in short-term exposure and long-term exposure. So for short-term exposure, considering 1 day or daily exposure, the maximum proportion of an assessment or habitat area utilized by a species of interest that is accepted to be exposed to impulsive noise levels higher than lobe. So we accept only over 1 day, 20% again of an animal or an habitat to be exposed to an exceeding value of the lobe. And for the long-term exposure, which is considered to be 1 year, this is the average exposure that is calculated, and the maximum proportion of an assessment habitat area utilized by the species of interest that is accepted to be exposed to impulsive noise levels higher than lobe over 1 year on average is 10% or lower. So we do not accept that there is an area exposed for more than 10% from impulsive sounds exposure, seismic activity, explosion, or pipe driving. So this is the current status of the EU regulation in terms of ocean noise. We are behind the calendar. I mentioned that the commitment from the member states and the EU Commission mandate was to be done by 2020, so we are in 2023. There is a lot of aspects that are not covered, mainly because it was very difficult to set what we understand is a good environmental status. When we speak about these different species, we are now speaking from plants to great whales. To have a definition of a good environmental status for all these different habitats that are inhabited by all these different species, from plants to great whales, it makes it very complex. But from this decision, it seems that now we have a tool that is enabling the member states and then the EU to properly address this issue of ocean noise. This is not a perfect decision, we know it, but at least if we compare where we were 12 years ago, I think there is a lot of progress that has been made, and this has to be revisited in the next months and the next years, and hopefully we will come back and explain where so we are. But at the moment, this is the current situation. Thank you very much.
Andrew 先生、ありがとうございました。では、
Dr. Andre, thank you very much. The next speaker is Dr. Brandon Southall, Duke University. Dr. Southall has many titles, and the part of it is at his own company.
An honor to be here. I'm very much enjoying your country. This is the second time I've been to Japan, and I'm really enjoying it. And Dr. Akamatsu, I appreciate you inviting me here today. I have a number of different affiliations. I've worked on bioacoustics and the effects of noise on animals through research in the laboratory and in the field. And for a time, I worked for the National Marine Fisheries Service of the United States, which is the regulatory agency that governs ocean noise. I am not speaking for that agency today, but I'll describe to you some of the work that I did and that the agency did to implement some of the first noise exposure criteria for marine mammals. As Dr. Andre said, it's very important that we look at other species beyond marine mammals, but I'll be speaking specifically about the marine mammal work today. And as he said, it's been about 20 years since we started that initial effort to try and develop guidance to relate the effect of noise on hearing and behavior. And we're really into sort of the second phase of that, and looking at changing some of the early efforts that were made. And I'll speak to that, primarily related to behavioral response. It may be important to just note why biological sounds or why sounds important in general are important to marine life. I feel like I should have a plant on here now, Michelle, but not just marine mammals, but all animals that live in water are particularly sensitive to sound and use sound because of the physics of the environment. Light doesn't travel as well. Chemical signals are less salient and relevant and persistent. So we know that the marine mammals and other species use sound for all the vital things that they do, finding one another, finding their food, avoiding predators, finding their way around. And people put sound into the ocean either on purpose to look for things or incidentally as a consequence of industrial activity. And so a lot of the questions that that my career is centered around and that we need to address are how can we use sound to eavesdrop on the animals themselves and know where they are and how they're distributed and how they may be behaving? What are the negative effects that do occur, and how can we reduce those effects? What are the things we can do to try and strategically quiet things, or as Michelle indicated, set limits to sort of protect certain environments in a strategic way. I added this slide kind of at the last minute, just in part to emphasize and maybe give a reference for all of the different places, entities, and I know there's a lot listed on there, but it just sort of highlights this paper by Emily Chow, which is pretty recent. It's a little out of date, 2 years into it. All of the different fora in which this issue has been addressed. Michelle addressed a lot of the European fora, but international entities around the globe, up to and including the United Nations, the International Maritime Organization, are addressing this issue, setting guidance, calling for action, and so it really is an international issue and a policy issue that's being addressed in a variety of ways. I was involved in the early efforts to get the issue of shipping noise addressed at the International Maritime Organization. The United States led the sort of first recognition of that at the IMO, and now the Canadian government and other countries are leading the second generation recommendations on quieting guidance that will be voted on at the IMO in London in next month. So it's an active, current, and very much an international policy issue. If we sort of take a high-level view of all the things that can happen when animals interact with noise, it's important for us to be able to distinguish between things that may be de minimis, not very important, up to things that are obviously very important because they result in mortality. And there's a whole scale of severity of responses that can occur that can range from just a simple orienting response up through behavioral responses that could include habitat avoidance or changes in foraging patterns, physiological effects. Many of the recent studies showing changes in stress hormone levels and other kinds of physiological effects are particularly important. And generally speaking, these things are decreasingly common but increasingly severe. So things like strandings are obviously very bad when they occur, but they typically don't occur very often. And those have received, at least with marine mammals, they've received sort of a disproportionate amount of attention because they're very dramatic events. But what about just the background noise of vessels that's increasing the ambient noise that causes animals to not be able to communicate in the ways that they could? Those kinds of effects, I think we've realized are particularly important to pay attention to. So this severity scaling was something that we realized early on was important for us to be able to account for in setting criteria. In 2007, and this was the result of about 5 years of effort, so it really was over 20 years ago that this process started, there was a paper that was published, and I was involved in it. There were a dozen experts from around the world that were involved in it, and it looked at both auditory hearing criteria as well as behavioral criteria, and it did a few important things. One of them was to just identify the fact that the animals are different from one another. A whale makes and probably hears sounds that are much lower in frequency than animals like dolphins and porpoises. So we split the animals up into what we called functional groups. And for those groups, we developed these curves that show differential sensitivity to different sounds and more or less likely impacts related to that. Quantitative filters to be able to apply these criteria. We distinguish the impulses and non-impulses, which has carried forward in some of the other approaches as Michelle described. And then we set these numerical levels for threshold shifts, meaning the hearing change that's either temporary threshold shift, TTS, or permanent, an actual loss of hearing that's permanent, or permanent threshold shift. And there were multiple different quantitative numerical metrics that went along with those. And for behavior, it is a little less quantitatively, empirically easy to define. But one of the things that we did was start to go down this road of relating the severity in and increasing or variable levels of severity, and we went through the literature, the existing literature, to look at for how loud different sounds were, what's the probability of responses occurring. And one of the things that's very obvious from that is there's not a single numerical value where below it there's no behavioral response and above it there is. It's a graded, probabilistic kind of a function that depends on a number of important things that I'll talk a little bit more about. But this paper really set kind of the first marker of effort to systematically put numbers associated with different types of responses of hearing and behavior. Okay, so we came back to this in 2019, and one of the important things we did was we split the hearing and the behavioral part apart. So there's two different papers I'm going to talk about. The first one with the auditory effects was to try, and I'm going to just cover this in just this one slide. We revisited all of the hearing groups and actually made a few more. One of the early focus of that first paper was what I led when I was working for the National Marine Fisheries Service. It didn't include all of the species. It only included the species that agency cared about, which was obviously not really a sufficient and complete way of considering it. So animals like polar bears and manatees weren't included. So there's actually more hearing groups. We refined some of it based on intervening information. And we took the hearing data and came up with these audiograms of how the animals hear. Those are then turned into these revised auditory filters, which basically tell us how sound of different frequencies is likely to impact animals. And then we came up with these exposure response functions where you have actual measurements of how the sound can cause temporary or permanent hearing threshold shifts, and they're converted into filters. So now you have a quantitative numerical frequency specific filter for each one of those, and there's ones for impulsive and non-impulsive, permanent and temporary threshold shift, each of them with multiple different metrics. So I'm not going to give you all the details of that, but they're in this 2019 paper. And that paper now forms the basis for regulatory policy for auditory effects in the United States and has been adopted in several other countries as well. The behavioral side is a little harder, I think in part because many of the auditory things are really sort of physics oriented. There's a lot of conservation across different species of how the auditory systems work. And for behavior, some of the challenges that we have really relate to the fact that the animals their behavior may be affected even naturally by things related to what's occurring around them at the time, what they're doing. Some of these things we call contextual factors are particularly important, and that's a theme that I'll kind of come back to. But several of the things we did in readdressing the behavioral criteria were to look at grouping the animals and the sounds differently than for hearing. There's some species that are just more sensitive than other species or more tolerant than other species, and they don't really follow the auditory groupings as well. And the impulsive and non-impulsive criteria are probably a little less important, but we propose categorizing the sounds in terms of the actual industrial activities, so like sonar, pile driving, vessel noise, and that was a real difference. And then when we re-evaluated some of the severity criteria, we took a few different approaches. One was to split out field observations and laboratory studies, and another one, and Michelle alluded to this, was getting this idea of fitness in. So looking at the responses as they related to things that affect fitness, like reproduction, survival, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also identified some places where we're not there yet, and that's really the next challenge, is to take some of these things to the longer durations, and I think the Europeans have provided some helpful steps there. So one of the important things is many of the early papers just lack some key information about what the exposure was. So there's a whole range of metrics, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but they include aspects of like, were the animals by themselves or not? Does the sound have some similarity to a predator sound? Is it novel in the environment? Are the animals in a place where they're constrained, or are they out in the open? And so having these kinds of metrics, and then a variety of different ways that we measure the sound, not just how loud it is, but how long it's there, what's the background noise at the time, and we quantified those in these metrics. So there's kind of a set of recommendations about more comprehensive data to be reported with the behavioral response. And then I just wanted to briefly sort of contrast the early approach, which, and this is only a part, the scale goes from 0 to 9. This is the sort of middle of the scale, where most of the kind of important distinctions are made between things that are either, raised to a level of what you might call a significant type of response. But in the early paper, we just sort of had a running list that related laboratory and field behaviors together, and it had some pretty vague terms like brief and moderate and minor. And when we went back to this for the more recent paper, the first thing we did was we put all the laboratory studies together, because the lab work, of which Dr. Akamatsu has done a fair amount earlier in his career, very important, very useful, very controlled. Measurements can be made very specifically, but the animals are not in a realistic kind of environment. So the behavioral responses are a little harder to interpret. And there's also a difference in laboratory studies between if an animal is trained to do something versus it's just living in a captive setting. So there's a whole series of descriptors of ways to try to distinguish those kinds of criteria. And then for the field part, and I don't expect you to read all of this, I think the key point is we split the behavioral changes into things that related to the probability of animals surviving, or things that might affect their probability of survival, foraging, and reproduction. And that segregation has really been important in some of the subsequent studies that are trying to now focus on these things, not just asking was there a behavioral change, but was there a behavioral change that affected feeding, and did it occur over the duration of exposure? Did it extend beyond that exposure? So I think we've gotten a little bit more specific and explicit guidance there. And I just have two examples. This paper goes through a number of papers and tries to carry this out and demonstrate how the application of this severity scale can be implemented. And for some of the industrial noise studies, there's less information. The earlier studies maybe have some things missing that you might like to have, like the sound exposure level, which is a metric of the duration. But we can go through, and we had to develop ways to say, if an animal is exposed multiple times, we can count those, but we don't want to count them, we want to weight those because you have multiple observations on the same animal. So we came up with these weighting ways of kind of relating that. Some of the studies on sonar have been more recent and a little bit more increasingly sophisticated in the metrics of how they're obtained and reported. And so, yeah, just examples of how these kinds of criteria can be implemented. One of the main things, and one of the last things I'll sort of touch on is all of those kinds of studies and the early criteria really looked at, here's an exposure and a response of an animal or of a group of animals, and the exposure was this loud and there was a response, yes or no, and you put these things into probabilistic functions. But what about really important studies that look at longer term trends? So here's a really useful paper by Paul Thompson looking at offshore wind farms, where they're looking at the behavior of populations of animals from one year to the next to the next. That really doesn't fit the severity criteria kind of approach and these probabilistic functions, and it definitely doesn't fit the initial approach of a single numerical value that was either yes, no behavioral response. So we need new ways to be able to take these types of data where you have patterns of populations over years and put them into probability functions or some way of relating those kind of longer term trends. And we thought about this and proposed some initial approaches in this 2021 paper where we tried to borrow some lessons from whale watching studies, so things that have been done over multiple years that look at some of these rates like calf survival and adult survival, and not just whether the population number was going up and down, but breaking some of those things out into population parameters and long-term metrics of reproductive success and survival. So it's kind of an initial stab at that, and then we applied some of these to a number of studies and used the whale watching literature as an example of how some of that could be done. But I think we're just at the beginning stages of trying to get some of these population level metrics. Another approach that we took in a paper that Enrico Perrotta did, built on some of these studies we did for blue whales. And this is just one quick example of these contextual factors. So if you look at the responses of blue whales to sonar, they respond increasingly less based on how far the sound source is away from the animal, even if the level of the sound is the same. So if the level of the sound doesn't change, but the source is farther away, the animals are less likely to respond. So they're ranging. They're determining that the source is farther away from them and responding less. So we see these types of contextual factors as being really important, along with a number of other ones that I won't even sort of get into, but maybe we can talk about in the discussion, which is how the prey environment is distributed and other factors, including what the animals are doing at the time. But Enrico's paper took these kinds of observations of near, far, intermediate sounds and incorporated some other parameters about ambient noise and the distribution of prey. And it was really, I think, forward-looking paper that tries to take these kind of instantaneous responses and put them into a longer-term kind of a context. So that's, I think, an important message that we need to incorporate these longer-term assessments. And we have some initial thoughts of how to do that. So taking some of these things to scale, and in conclusion here, it's just probably important to emphasize how much attention there is to this issue at a variety of different international efforts. There's a variety of different steps moving forward. The U.S., within the U.S., the National Marine Fisheries Service is working on behavioral response functions that are probabilistic functions that incorporate some of these kinds of things. I'm working with the Australian government on implementing some of these types of approaches as well. Even though we started, I think one of the main messages from the early paper that we did was it was a bit of a mistake to group the hearing and the behavioral things in some ways that we did, and we've deliberately tried to break those things apart because the hearing, it's not easy, but it's easier than the behavioral effects, and some of the ways we've grouped them for hearing don't make sense for behavior, so we've kind of deliberately taken those things apart. And then this is probably more important for most of the rest of the world, looking at longer term exposures and population level effects. The US has kind of a quirky definition of what we call behavioral takes, that it's more about like an exposure and a response, but really the population and the longer term ones probably matter a little bit more. So I'm hopeful that we can learn from things in Europe and others that have been making some progress there. These contextual factors are just over and over again in the literature. We're showing that it's just, you can't just look at how loud the sound is and how likely the animals are to respond. We have to consider some of these things. And then finally, and I haven't even really hit on this very much, incorporating some of these physiological measurements like stress hormones into behavioral response studies is important and occurring. So yeah, thank you very much, and I appreciate being here and look forward to the discussion.
宗太郎先生ありがとうございました。非常に多くの
Dr. Southall, thank you very much indeed describing for us the detail of the situation in the United States. The next speaker is Professor Chen-Fan Chen from National Taiwan University.
I've learned Japanese for three years, but then I really can't speak too much of it. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I really feel very honored. I mean, being talked after Michelle and Brandon here. And actually I was assigned to talk about the Asian cases, but then I can only do for Taiwan. But of course that here Japan has come up more and more, I mean, to interact with Tom, realize that these issues, the noise issues, is being more kind of raise the awareness or concerns. So then I would like to talk about how we learn our learning curves in Taiwan. Oh, sorry, do I need to do that? Okay. And so actually what I'm talking about will be, we have done a small review papers for what we have studied the passive acoustic monitoring results in the western part of Taiwan. And so these are my groups, and we kind of summarize what we had done for the past decades. I've been working on underwater acoustics for my whole career, but then it was only until 2009 that I started to realize that the underwater acoustics can apply to more civilian or more other issues than the military applications. And so in 2009, there is a very important event that is called the Tiger Project. And the Tiger Project is that the US geophysical exploration vessels come to Taiwan, and they're using the air guns to really go all around Taiwan to try to get the continental merging, I mean, the tectonic shift. But then what happened was that there is this critical endangered species, the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin, which is we call the Chinese white dolphins. And it has been a concern that it is in the western side of Taiwan, and they are so close to a coast. And so thanks to the NGOs from Canada, from US, and together with the Taiwan NGO to raise a concern. And thus, that starting from the 2009 that I was asked to look into the issues, and that started my career, my research path, divert myself from the military application of underwater acoustics to more peaceful applications. And I'm very fond of it, and I really like it. And so, and then also starting from 2012, that the Taiwan government has announced this the renewable energy strategy, which is we want to build offshore wind farm in Taiwan waters. And so starting from 2012, that we look into work on with academics or from the companies, the environmental impact assessment, about noise impact to the marine life, and especially for the Chinese white dolphins. And then, and now that I'm not just talking about the noise impact, we are also using the passive acoustic monitoring to observe the dolphins, observe the marine life. And so this is quite my career path here. And so from this path, this is the Chinese white dolphin. They're very cute, as cute as the finless dolphin. And they are pink when they're getting old. And they just, the populations of we call the major or important habitat is along the coast of Taiwan. Okay, this is where it was being observed by Professor Zhou, another team. And then this is in the beginning, the potential offshore wind farm site. So you can see that these are the dolphins' habitat, and these are the offshore wind farms. And so it has created a big impact and a stress on their life. And so, so we have staff first is working on this underwater noise impact range alert system, meaning that from each pile, how can we see that the noise impact ranges. At this point that we are using the 180 dB, 160 dB. So the red one is 180, then the blue one is 160 dB. But then later on that it has changed, but that's at the beginning efforts. And so from then on, we have put down all these underwater, the hydrophones to do the soundscape, to do the noise measurement, some of them including some pile driving event. And so this is the beginning, like 2012, and now it's 2023, 10 years after, there are actually quite a lot of turbines has already been installed. So we are very fortunate in our team that we have a pre-offshore wind farm measurement, and during the offshore wind farm measurement, and now, it's a continual phase. So around Taiwan, that you can see that from this color plots, that there's quite some difference, the spatial and temporal variations. And this is the very famous Wentz curve for the background noise, which is deep ocean and open ocean. But then in this coastal waters, this is our measurement. And you see that the differences, especially for these two peaks, which are the bionoise that I will talk about. And at first we used these SM2Ms, okay, but they are no longer in production. And lately we use most of them, the sound traps as a New Zealand products. We kind of put them down in the ocean bottom and then do a long-term measurement for 1 month or 2 months and then replace them. And so, so there are some stations that majorly in the northern of Taiwan, Miaoli, and then about the middle part of Taiwan, that is like the belly, which is like a sweet potato, and then the widest part. And this is Taichung, meaning the middle part of Taiwan. And so look at the ambient noise part. You can see that for one stations, the ranges can be from 110 dB up to some of the extreme is like 140 or even up. But then the medians kind of stay around here and 110 and 120. But then you do see the differences, whether it is on different seasons or different years, okay, or different places. So even along the coast, we see the variations. And just show some of the typical spectrum. That is the 1 Hertz band. And so in the middle, that is a lot of fish chorus energy bandwidth here. So let me, this is just a quick squirk. This is the total of how the fish calls. And the fish calls, they have a pattern. They start when the sun sets, and then another peak is before the sunrise. And please keep quiet in between. Okay, and these patterns also changes with the seasons. So so this is like the whole year, okay, and then this is a temperature, and this is how the energy of the fish chorus. And you can see that that's actually the seasonal, whether it's because sea surface temperature or because it's a season. And actually they pretty much become quieter during the winter. But then some people may say because the fish just swim to other places. So there's still a lot more to study about it. And then in terms of tide, so this is the full moon, and this is the new moon. And then you can see that there is actually some of the changes. Okay, other than the fish, there is also the dolphins, which is Brandon had just mentioned, and they have this is a whale. But then the dolphins have different calls, so it's also in our data set. And then not just the bioacoustics, there's also the nature effect, the typhoon effect. When there's a typhoon comes, then of course there's a lot of sediment transport and wind waves, and then so causing the background noise increased. And then how would this typhoon effect on the fish chorus? And these are the fish chorus, okay, the patterns. And this is when the typhoon enter Taiwan and leaving Taiwan. So you see that these are the typhoon noise, right, from the wind wave, from the sediment transport. But then looking at the fish chorus, they kind of know that typhoon is coming, so they become quieter. And okay, and they come back after typhoon leaves. And so it's kind of a chain reactions. And then ship activities also been picked up, the ferry noise. This comes in on the schedule. Okay, and then other like dredging noise and ferry noise, they also been picked up by our measurement. One of the first offshore wind turbine that was installed in Taiwan, that we are very fortunate that been there 2016, September. And so because we just put the hydrophone there, so we pick up the whole activities. And because that was the first time, usually it's not like this pattern. It was first time, and the way they some of the things did not go very smoothly, so they have stopped. And so this pilot just took almost 12 hours to finish, which is very unlikely, because now, since more piles been driven down, so it's like 3 or 4 hours, then the whole process will be done. And so that is the sound exposure level for the complete piling noise, okay? And if we look close in, that the operating noise at 1 hertz band, and also the 1/3 octave band, and this is like in the close look, and this is in further away, about 10 kilometers away. You can see that the energy dropped down from 170 dB down to 120, but then there is still some, the major frequencies can still be picked up. Coming to a little bit about the guidance that it's been talked about, but then the whole learning curve, I think, is the community is learning, and then society is learning. So in an EIA or in our EPA meetings to approve for these projects, there's a lot of debates, even argument. Okay, so finally at 2019, which is not too long ago, that the first guidelines for underwater noise measurement method was being announced by our environmental protection agencies. And I remember when I was attending Michelle's conference in ocean noise, I keep raising the issue. How do you do that? How do you do that? So I actually learned from your conference, 2016, and oh no, 15, and so, but then this message, I learned a lot, and I was doing service. But then in our EPA meetings, you know what happened? They go like, the Ørsted, let's go with the German standard. Okay, anyway, so my view is that if we do not study the dolphin themselves, we really have no say of how we should set the noise limit. So pretty much in Taiwan, we are really following the European, the Americans' colleagues' footsteps, and then just learn from them. And not just in our environmental protection agencies, the highest government agency, the Ocean Affairs Council in Taiwan, they are also been asked to look into these issues and to have a guidelines about the underwater noise measurement, which is more related to marine conservation agencies. So we'll be more towards this. So the concern and the awareness is increasing in Taiwan, and then with the offshore wind farm developers' commitment, I think we are doing, we are at this point, most of it is like here, kind of the German standards at where the pile driving site and 750 meters, that the noise exposure levels should not exceed 160 dB. And so this is how we has suggested, recommended, not just one site. I think that's how the German did. It's only one measurement. But in Taiwan, because there's this azimuthal directivities, so we asked for four sites just in the 750 meters. And not just the noise monitoring stations being put down, there is also that the observation, visual observation, and also the underwater, the PAM stations being put on, and on this 4 sites. And so it has been like this. And so not just the noise, and also we need to observe where there's dolphin activities coming in. And I really thank Susa chinensis, which is a Chinese white dolphin. Without that, nobody cares what happens down in the waters. And so ever since then, that is, we have been doing this, and I found this work very meaningful. Thank you.
はい、チェンチェさんありがとうございました。それでは皆様からの質問を受け付ける前にですね、日本の代表者として京都大学の准教授木村先生をパネリストとしてお迎えしておりますので、木村先生からも一言コメントいただければと思います。よろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございます。入ってます。京都大学の木村です。私も若輩者というかもう未熟ではあるんですけれども、今日ご登壇の先生方と同じような研究をしておりまして、水中の音響のセンシングを通じて、生態系を見たり、対象の動物の存在であったり行動であったりを、調べたりですとか、影響を評価するような研究を行っております。今日は本当に素晴らしい先生方と同じテーブルにつくことができてとても光栄です。で今日他の先生方からもたくさんお話があったように、海洋開発ですとか、例えば漁業とか地震の探査、あるいは海底の資源探査で、そしてそれに伴う船の航行、船舶航行と、近年日本でも広まっております洋上風力発電の建設や操業などで非常に多くの音が発生しますが、今日先生方からもお話があったように対象の動物の種類とか行動によっても影響がかなり異なります。で先ほどチーファン先生から台湾の事例は少しご紹介がありましたが、日本を含めアジアに生息する種類の海の中にいる生物の海洋騒音の影響というのは、欧米よりももう何段階も 研究も遅れておりますし、対策等ももちろん遅れているというのが現状です。で一方で、日本もそうですし、アジアを見てもそうなんですけれども、亜寒帯から熱帯までかなり幅広い温度帯を、含んでおりますので、かなり多くの生物の量ですね、資源量があって、生物の種類も多いですし、量もかなり多いということが背景としてあって、なので人間もたくさんそのような資源を、海から搾取しているというのも同時に起こっています。漁業への依存度もかなり高いので、今後海洋騒音問題については、将来的にますます多くの資源を日本もかけていかなければならないと思います。で資源というのは、お金や時間だけではなくて、やはり携わる人間の数、あるいは意識して気にかけてくれる人たちの数というのも非常に重要だと思っています。でなので研究者や政策側の人間だけじゃなくて、漁業者であったりとか、船を作ったりとか海洋開発に携わる人々、アセスメントに携わる人々を含め、皆様の意識も含めて意識を高めていくようなことが必要なので、そのような未来の実現に向けては社会への啓発というのがすごく重要になりますので、本日改めてこのような機会があって設けていただいて、非常に多くの人がこの問題に関心を持って学ぶことができて、大変有意義な時間になったと思います。これからパネルディスカッションもありますけれども、本日私もすごくたくさんのことを学ぶことができましたので、改めて開催にご尽力いただいた皆様ありがとうございます。私からは以上です。ありがとうございます。
はい、木村先生ありがとうございました。今日は会場には40数名ぐらいですかね、いらっしゃっていただいてますけども、多分オンラインで100数十名か200名近く入ってると思います。相当の数の人たちが関心を寄せている。
So many people have taken an interest, and we will have a panel discussion, and then after that we will hear from the participants, and those of you who are participating online, please don't feel bashful. You can also ask through the screen, and therefore I would like you to raise your hand if you have a question.
もし差し支えなければ、
Please state your name and affiliation.
神戸大学
Hasebe from Kobe University, and let me ask the question in English. And in the IMO, basically, the noise from vessels, I think, is a focus of discussion. And today, we heard from Professor Chen and others about the offshore wind turbines and noise from that. It is very refreshing to hear about that. Offshore wind, there's a lot of floating type of turbines which are going to be built. And then there's the conventional, which are fixed offshore wind turbines. And compared to that, the floating wind turbines in a large scale, from the perspective of noise, is it more adverse, or is it going to have a better impact compared to the fixed type? How would you compare the fixed and the floating type? Professor Chen and Professor Brandon?
I think that the floatings will be more impact than the fixed ones. However, there's still concern because to put the floating fixed in a way that they still need some sort of heavy anchor or pilings. So that is maybe less impact than the monopile or the jacket, but you can add.
Yeah, I would just add, there's a lot we don't know about the floating as it's going to be implemented. So I live in California. All the leases that have been sold in California are going to involve floating wind, some of it in over 1,000 meters of water. And so how they're going to hold those, I mean, as you say, there's going to be anchors, probably not, it will involve maybe pin piles. So there's some noise associated with the installation. I think definitely going to involve less high impulse noise associated with the kind of 10-meter piles for conventional ones. The other concern, though, once they're in, is what about other effects that aren't auditory effects, like entanglement or entanglement of things that get entangled on the lines. There'll be a lot of cables and support things. So I think some of the noise effects may be reduced, but some of these other effects are just to be considered and somewhat unknown, because there have been floating platforms put in places in Europe, but no one's ever put them in 1,000 meters of water 30 miles offshore.
はい、じゃあヨーロッパの視点からアンドレ先生いかがでしょうか。
Professor Andre?
Yes, well, my colleague just answered the data that we have at the moment from our experience in existing windmills that are not flooding is that the impact is mostly related to the construction phase. That takes a few months to install the mills, and yet in terms of the invertebrates, which is what we looked at, the scallops, but also the cuttlefish, this impact is reduced to an area that is less than 500 meters from the construction site, which means that this is an impact, of course, but after 500 meters, the impact is less important. So we, based on this, and although we don't have data on the floating platform yet, we can expect that this impact will be less than what we found with the construction phase with the monopile, and that involves the drilling and the pile driving. This is what I would say at the moment.
はい、ありがとうございました。ご質問。
Thank you very much. Next question, please. Thank you.
I'm the member of GEPCO, General Bathymetric Chart of the Ocean, measuring the sea depth using the echo sounder by irritating fish and sometimes dropping lead line to hit the head of fish. So I'm a bad guy. My question is to Professor Andre. European Commission is thinking about underwater acoustic noise, and does that include river and lake and pond, or only the ocean, seas?
Thank you very much. It includes estuary and coastal rivers, although the effort has been mainly put on oceans. But speaking about echo sounders, when back in 2008 we started to look at indicators, we proposed 3 indicators, the 2 that I mentioned, impulsive and continuous, but we had also high frequency impulsive sounds that are related to these echo sounders on yachts and private vessels, which we know is very important in a certain coast in the Mediterranean, but also in the North Sea. And these echo sounders, they produce sound at frequencies that are audible for most of the marine animals. And the proposition was to monitor, but to propose that these echo sounders were to produce sounds above 200 kilohertz, which is at the moment the limit that we think of in terms of the capacity of marine life to hear sound. So we believe that if the echo sounders were producing sounds above 200 kilohertz, we will be limiting this effect. But yes, so it's not yet one of the indicators, but hopefully we will address this in the next future.
Thank you. Above 200 kilohertz, the penetration of the echo sound is limited for only the shallow water, and for deeper ocean, we use 12 kilohertz, which may be irritating. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございました。他にご質問ございますでしょうか。オンラインから。
Next question, please. We have before taking a question online, I'd like to give the floor to another person in the hall. Thank you very much. My name is Nagata. I have a question to Dr. Andre. Previously in your presentation, you said that the underwater noise impacts the seagrass as well. So distribution or the impacts in what way to the impact on the distribution of the seagrasses or the growth rate of the seagrass. Would you please tell me more specifically or more in detail?
Yes, thank you very much. This is a study that dealt with the physiological effect of sound. We exposed the seagrass to human noise, or human generated noise, and look at the not only the growth but the status of the statocysts, which are the sensory organs that are responsible for the management of gravity in these plants. And the lesions that we found were permanent lesions that were preventing them to relate to the environment, so they were not able to deal with gravity. But also we saw that their symbiosis with some mushrooms that are important for their feeding, the feeding behavior was also affected by this exposure to sound. So both at both levels, first for the management of the gravity, and then second for the capacity to grow through the feeding symbiosis with these fungi.
よろしいでしょうか。はい。オンラインからも一つ質問が来ておりまして、
Question online from Okazaki-san, and let me try to modify. In US and Taiwan, you have various restrictions. How about the grounding of the whales? And it could be the effect of the military sonars or in the mid-frequency. And so this mid-frequency sonar, is that being restricted? And if it is being restricted, has this kind of stranding accident decreased?
There's no restrictions. Well, it's not a concern yet. Sorry.
So for the U.S., most of the early research on sonar impacts has been motivated by these observations in the Bahamas and the Canary Islands and other places. And a lot of the work, including the work I discussed about blue whales, was funded by the Navy and has gotten to the point where we're actually working directly with Navy ships, full destroyer, cruiser, tactical sonar systems. And I think we found a lot about why some of these strandings occur. For particular species, the beaked whales are the most sensitive. I think we are close to understanding what is going on. I think there's a similarity of those certain types of signals to predator sounds that we think is triggering a flight response, that when there are multiple vessels or where the activity is happening in places where there's a lot of reverberation, the animals can't figure out where to go. They wind up going into shallow water, and really most of the mortalities happen from the animals overheating because they're out of their typical habitat. And to answer the question directly, yes, there have been several modifications to activities, including limiting what they call choke point exercises, where they occur in these concentrated places. Their training does need to happen in some of those places because tactically submarines will try and use those places to hide. But there are now different limits and restrictions on that. They typically don't use multiple vessels there. And there are also examples from parts of the west coast of the US where for certain seasons and certain places, there are limits or complete restrictions on training for both beaked whales and blue whales that are a result of some of this. So fairly limited, but yes, some specific modification of activity based on the research that we can point to.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I can only agree with what was said. I will maybe add the fact that despite the potential harm that these Navy sonar might have on whales and dolphins, that we have not yet found evidence in terms at the more on the population level of a broad effect. So it might affect some individual potentially, and maybe a group, but in terms of the population, we have not yet found any evidence of it. And this is also true with other human noises that we know can have an effect, particularly this seismic campaign. We know that potentially these noises can affect not only whales and dolphins, but also other living creature. But we have not yet found an evidence, except more on the invertebrate. And this is one of the discussions we had in terms of on how the behavior of the whales, so the predators, is affected by noise-induced effect on the prey. And you probably, I don't know if we agree on that, but maybe this is a matter to look at in the future, how the whales react to a prey that is affected by noise. And we have not yet done that.
Okay, thank you. それではだいぶ議論も時間も
Well, I think we are running out of time, but I want to ask what we should do going forward and ask each speaker. That is the situation in Japan. Well, as was mentioned, unfortunately, compared to US and Europe, we're still behind. And so, on the other hand, in terms of mineral resource development or the floating wind turbines offshore or the unmanned vessels and also long distance autonomous vehicles, AUVs, the government is also trying to increase all of this as well as other countries. So the activities are going forward, but the monitoring and regulation, we're still groping in the dark, especially in Asia. I think that is the case. And so we heard today from Andre-san, LOBE, about that indicator. And with regards to how to make such a standard, there is a long document, and just coming up with one standard, you have to think about all kinds of factors. And what I want to ask each of you is, there is the background noise level and also species diversification depending on each region. Of course, that's going to differ depending on US, Europe, or Japan. So what is it that we should investigate and what should we do? That is the question that I want to ask you. And my understanding up to this point is, first of all, we have to map the noise, do noise mapping. Second is there will be the living creatures that will be impacted. We need to create a map of that distribution. And then if we do both, then in case there could be severe impact and say more than 20% impact to the animals, then that would be a concern. So I thought maybe the noise assessment has to be done in that way. But this is just a rough understanding. And so I'd like to ask the experts what we should do going forward. Michelle-san, please.
Well, yes. So this, I mean, I don't think that Japan is behind, maybe in time, but not with the technology. And this is important. When we started a few years ago, the technology was not ready. Now the technology and the knowledge is here, so it's easier to get up to speed in the countries that have not yet implemented any measure. So I don't think that this would take a very long time to find a way to assess this ocean noise issue in Japan. What I have a personal view on the challenge that we have, if we speak about science, is, as I mentioned, 20 years ago when we first started speaking about this noise pollution, we thought, okay, when we know the sensitivity, the acoustic sensitivity of the roughly 89 species of whales and dolphins, then we are all set, and then we will be able to put some threshold, and then everybody will have enough data, the industry and and this was when we thought of this roughly 90 species. Now that we know that the whole ecosystem is affected, and we are speaking about thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of species, we don't have time in our life and not in the next lives to assess this sensitivity to noise with all these species. So we have to find another way because we don't have time. Time is tight now, and I think that if we accept that an habitat that is in a good health is an habitat that is rich with these species that we know of, and they are both prey and predators. And if we accept that the bioacoustic activity can be a proxy to the biological activity, then the technology is already there to monitor this bioacoustic activity, building trends, and look at how these trends change from external pressure, it could be human activity or climate change, and this would give us a sort of immediate insight on how noise can affect an habitat. So I would favor, if I had any influence in the next years, to look at this possibility to extract the bioacoustic activity from the noise activity and from the natural activity, and from these build trends and look at changes of these trends in parallel to look at the sensitivity of the species that we have to still do, of course, but to speed up the process. This is what I would personally do.
Thank you very much. So,
I think the first question that you need to think about is, what is the regulatory structure of the country, and how does it address, or how is it set up to consider either individual species or groups of species or whole environments, or and how it's set up to deal with things in time. And you've seen, if you look at these other examples, you've seen very different approaches in Europe where you have this environmental ecosystem kind of perspective, and then in the US you have really an individual-based kind of a perspective, and that's why these kind of acute, single exposure and hearing and behavioral effects on individuals that then get scaled up to populations kind of approach. And those are two really different ways of thinking about it. And so part of it is how is the existing policy and regulation in the country set, and does it really require one of those approaches or another? And there's pros and cons of each of them. The US is kind of funny relative to the rest of the world in having this really discrete, acute kind of approach. And I think, to me, a combination of those approaches kind of makes sense, because one of the regulatory things that I think we should be doing is trying to prevent really dramatically bad things from happening to animals, like deafening animals with sounds. So that's a part, and that's where I think the US approach of these hearing impacts and the level A thresholds, and that 2019 paper that has the weighting functions and the thresholds and the hearing groups, that fits that kind of goal. But those are pretty rare cases, or they're unlikely sorts of outcomes. They should be, implemented in a way to protect against dramatic physical injury. But most of the issue relates to the behavioral and all of the sublethal kinds of things. And that's where I think looking at the European kind of approach and moving away from these acute behavioral responses and trying to relate them in risk functions, even though we're still trying to improve those, but getting to these longer term population level and ecosystem approaches where you acknowledge you're dealing with multiple, different species simultaneously for the reasons that Michelle gave. So I think kind of a combination type of approach, but the first question is really, what is the existing regulatory structure, and does it have a particular kind of requirement in it? The other thing that's hard about the U.S. case is it's so easy for people to sue each other. The litigation comes in, so it's just a very defensive type of approach instead of more of a proactive kind of approach and progressive approach that the Europeans have taken.
I would also add something that is in parallel of what we just said, is that developing techniques to quiet human activities is for sure a way to go. We know that. We know that if we produce less noise, the impact will be less. So we know how to do it, but we should implement and try to quiet this human activity as much as we can.
Thank you. チェン先生。
From my point of view is that who has the most concern? Because in Taiwan, it's because we have this critically endangered species. Without that, there's no motivation. Without that, there's no money, no developer willing to put money in it. So I don't know whether it's a Japan case or not. Of course, I really appreciate and I love the European approach. It's like we want to have a good environment. And so we want to keep the ocean as quiet as before, which I totally agree. But then how do we convince the government to do that? I think that's what the challenges that we have in Taiwan. So instead of, in Taiwan, that's my approach now. Instead of trying to tell them that the ecosystem is being affected by human activities, I go like, well, let's put more PAM stations around Taiwan because our national security needs it. And once we have that data, I will have a noise map. And that's how my approach is now. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Social agreement requirement, that's important. Okay. 木村先生、お願いします。
ありがとうございます。
Professor Kimura, thank you. Yes, as other panelists stated, yes, I have basically the same opinion as Professor Andre said. In addition to the regulations, yes, it's difficult to end man-made human activities at sea. But if we are to have the more quiet technology, more tools, then there would be less need for regulations. So we are here, 5 of us on the stage, to attend the international meeting until yesterday. And we saw overseas participants, and the monopile, the offshore, the wind turbines could be more quieted. They could be made more quieter, and also the shape of propellers could be changed in order to reduce the noise level. Such research going on. These research might not be very attractive from the funding perspective, but these technologies are very important. And as Dr. Takamatsu said, the mapping of the distribution of the organisms, and we cannot see directly what's there at sea. Our knowledge about the distribution of the marine organisms is very limited. So that's what, therefore, we have been working on it as researchers, particularly in 2 areas. One, we use the tool of soundscape, collecting various sounds in order to see the trend of the biosphere that's going on worldwide. And another is what I'm doing. There are umbrella species, and that would impact on other species. And we focus monitoring on these species. And Dr. Chen talked about the Sosa sinensis or the Indo-Pacific, the humpback dolphin distributed widely in the Southeast Asia and Taiwan, and also the finless porpoise is also the endangered species, and they are sensitive to noise, and their main habitats are coastal areas. And so the fish, they eat the variety of the species in such the areas, including squid, the prawns, and the other fish. And these are the other species that we should also focus on in our monitoring. Thank you very much. We are already behind schedule, but we really appreciate your inputs. And we have the online participants, but we now close the program for the online participants, and the remaining time, we have the exchanges with the people in the hall. So until the 11:59 tonight, our questionnaire survey is open. So I appreciate your the candid opinions. We'd like to improve our programs based on these their responses. And please check out our website and our mail magazine for our future programs. So thank you very much indeed to our online participants. And we have a little bit more free discussion time for the people in this hall. This concludes the online distribution of today's Ocean Forum. Thank you.